I will introduce Greg Gorga, our speaker for tonight. Greg is the executive director of Santa Barbara Maritime Museum, our lovely sister museum up the road a ways. He's been the executive director since 2008. Came to them in 2007, and his background, he has a degree in English and a minor in psychology. So if anybody's thinking that their grandkids are in liberal arts, well, there's hope. There's hope. And he got those at Rutgers, so that's a step too. He has been the executive director of the Council of American Maritime Museum, CAMM, which is a very special organization for those of us in the Maritime Museum field, and he has formerly served as the chair of the City of Santa Barbara's Community Development and Human Resources Committees. So he's going to talk to us very specifically about the history of the oil in the Santa Barbara Channel. So let's welcome Greg Gorga.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again. Can you all hear me? Yeah, all right. So when I signed up for this quite a few months ago, I'm glad to see everybody here because since I signed up to do this talk, Peter's left for Wisconsin, Bill's in Alaska. I'm starting to get nervous. They're all trying to avoid me. By the way, Kimberly Ford, your singer in that event, wonderful. So you want to come and go to that event. It was 11 years ago that I became the permanent executive director at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum this month. And I do have to say that Bill Conroy was the first person to reach out to me. He came up and visited me and then invited me down here to tour the museum in your old facility. And so Bill was really welcoming to me when I became an executive director. So I have a strong affiliation and love for this museum. And I hope you enjoyed the Marine Megatropolis exhibit that came from the Santa Barbara before this exhibit. This is also a very nice exhibit. At the end of my talk, I got a new exhibit for you to bring down. So I'll try to sell you on that one. So we're here to talk about a subject everyone can agree with. Right. Oh boy. Oh, oil. Yes. Trust me, Santa Barbara. Whew, oh my gosh. Really controversial. So, isn't that beautiful? That is. Anybody been to Summerlin? You recognize that? We'll talk about it a little bit later, but that is beautiful Summerlin. But oil in our channel goes way back, okay? These are some of the natural seeps that are in our channel, and oil has been bubbling up naturally, and gas, methane gas, for thousands of years in our Santa Barbara channel. In fact, the natural seepage here in our channel is the second largest natural seepage in the world. And if you haven't been out at Cole Point off UCSB, I've been boating out there, and I have seen bubbles of methane gas the size of grapefruits, and not one or two. It feels like you're in the middle of a champagne glass. That is the largest methane polluter in the county of Santa Barbara, and it's just naturally seeping up. And the Chumash, our first mariners that I know of, made great use of that asphaltum that was bubbling up, that oil naturally. All right, that's what they used to seal their the tamals with, which they're very famous for. One of only two civilizations to build plank canoes. Everybody else was doing dugouts. Well, that was yap, pine tar and asphalt that sealed those planks together. But they didn't just use it for that. They used it for tools. They'd hold hairs together to make brushes, tools. They'd cover all the holes in an abalone shelf so they have a scoop. I'd use it for drills, cover a bone or a stick with tar. But most importantly, besides the tamal, was they were able to carry fresh water. They would weave these baskets, throw in clumps of tar, throw in hot rocks, swirl that all around, and it would seal their baskets, and so they were able to carry fresh water. One of the only civilizations to do that, and that's why their civilization went from way up above Point Conception to, I think, as far down as down here, right? The Chumash down here? Sure. All right, so we have these tar pits, these asphaltum everywhere. In the 1880s, 70s, we started paving our streets. And so in Carpinteria, in Goleta, at UCSB, they were mining asphaltum there. More Mesa too, it's kind of Goleta there, and a lot of it. And it was they took that asphaltum all the way out to New Orleans, Los Angeles, San Francisco to pave roads. Anybody familiar with the UCSB campus? Right? You know this lagoon? That was a giant tar pit, just like the La Brea tar pits, but no animals stuck in there. In fact, this building is right around there. See that hedge? That covered the shaft that they used to mine the tar, the asphaltum. So that was a giant pit. And it was all over our coastline there, up on the hills. I still hate the smell of tar. So can you imagine working in those tar pits all day long? Oh my gosh. Not easy. But they are pulling apart the roadsides. Alcatraz Mining Company is one of the big companies. They, of course, came down from San Francisco to mine tar down there. But let's talk a little bit more about oil. So whaling was our source of energy, right? Whale oil. And that really was one of United States' first big industries. We were leaders in production of whale oil. Of course, coming all the way around Cape Horn to Pacific waters to hunt whales. Then we started using a lot of coal, but not a lot of coal on the West Coast, right? So oil really replaced whale oil, and it was an alternative, especially here on the West Coast, for coal. Oil was first discovered and utilized in Titusville, Pennsylvania. All right. Now, when they started getting that oil out of the ground, they needed something to put it in. And you know what they used? Old whiskey barrels. So to this day, a barrel of oil is measured as 42 gallons, but that's never really been used for mass production of oil. But it is what they measured based on the old whiskey and beer barrels. I just love that fact. And of course, we're using oil for lighting. So our lighthouse lens, the Fresnel lens, used oil. Could have used oil. But then, of course, we started using automobiles, and lighting, of course. But then the automobile really energized that oil industry. And as I mentioned, Summerlin was the world's first offshore oil wells. All right, they built piers out into the water, and they drilled down there. Now, these weren't real productive. They weren't really successful. Of course, they did the same thing in Elwood, further up past UCSB. Those were much later, though. They wouldn't have been wooden. These were all old wooden wells. Welcome to Santa Barbara, huh? Oh, you'll really get a laugh in just a second. We were actually really proud of these oil wells. These are postcards. Look at that. Come visit Santa Barbara. Ventura and Santa Barbara. All right. Now you all know those are, this has been in the news, those old wells have been leaking, right? In fact, I think the state just passed and put some money to fill those wells to stop that seepage. So there's natural seepage in our channel, and there's seepage from these old wells. Well, I actually saw this diver just this morning. He was at the museum. So back in the 50s, I believe this was, the government said, okay, we need to fill up and close these wellheads right off Summerlin. And he said, well, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, just throw sticks of dynamite down there. All right? He says, I never worked with dynamite. He goes, well, just go to the fire department. They'll tell you what to do. True story. So these are the old wells sticking out of the water there. All right. This is him with his young boy figuring out what to do. And that's what they did. They just threw dynamite down there and had these giant explosions. I feel sorry for the fish that were nearby. But that's what the government told them to do. That's how we do it. They didn't know any better. So shocking that they're leaking today, right? But hopefully there's companies today that are going to seal those properly. Anybody recognize this gas station? Montecito, yeah. I'm sorry. Up by the Bacara, or now the Ritz-Carlton, out by what's the golf course out there? Which this is if you've been to the Santa Barbara Zoo, the entrance is designed after this gas station. I love this gas station. So Pearl Chase, I don't know if you know that name down here, but she was the person responsible for the Spanish Revival look in Santa Barbara. Very influential. She sponsored beauty contests for service stations. She said, good style is good business. And so we had some nice looking service stations back then. Look at that. Remember that? I was just in Oregon. They still pump your gas for you up in Oregon. They didn't ask to check the oil, though, or wash the windows for me. And then, of course, all these wonderful oil companies started propping up. Okay? And then, of course, we also had the first attack on U.S. mainland soil was right after Pearl Harbor, less than 3 months after Pearl Harbor, at Elwood. Like I said, it's up by northwest of the UCSB campus. And it was the same thing. There was oil, the platforms out in the water. There was a little bit of a refinery there. A Japanese sub popped up and had a deck gun, and it lobbed 25 shells trying to hit that oil. Nobody was killed, nobody hurt, but you could see some of the shrapnel holes. That door is actually in our museum now. And of course, they just passed the law to intern all the Japanese for World War II, but this really pushed that forward. The people panicked. They thought the Japanese were going to attack all along our coastline. And then they turned to, they needed people to patrol the coastline, right, and look for future Japanese attacks, and the military was too busy fighting the war, so they employed Boy Scouts. And you can get a merit badge for doing coastal patrol. We have a couple of those merit badges in our exhibit now. Right? Isn't that wow? Yeah. Anybody been out to one of these platforms? I would love to do that. So we have, I think, 20 oil platforms out there. These are less than 1,000 feet deep. They are secured to the ocean floor. And these are like little mini cities. Okay, these are all the jobs out there, the control rooms, the staff, the crew usually go out there 7 days on, 7 off. This is how, I don't know if you can see that good, but that's how they get on and off the platform. So you're on a boat, it takes you out to the platforms, and that's rocking up and down, right? And then they bring this basket, swing this basket over, and you're on the outside of that basket, not inside. Inside they throw gear and stuff on, and you're holding on to these ropes like this, and then they swing you up and swing you over, right? And land you, which is not too bad, but imagine going back the other way onto that boat as it's going up and down, right? I had a group from Chevron come by for a tour. They're up from Houston, and I wanted to get home, and they wanted to come in at 4 o'clock. I'm like, can you come a little earlier? They're like, no, we're doing a rope, what do they call it? Rope training. And I thought it was like some kind of team building or something. No, they're heading out to the platform the next day, and they needed to pass a class on how to do that transition from the platform to the boat. But they have it is like a little mini city. There's laundry out there. They get 4 meals a day. They have a gymnasium. They have entertainment. And of course, they have the helicopter pad to get off there in emergency. And they also have, by the way, there's a stairway from the water line all the way up, but they have to gate it because the seals and sea lions will come right on up. Yeah, oh yeah, yes. They are not shy. So I mentioned that methane gas that seeps up, right? That is so big that at one point, I think it was Exxon, put these 2 giant 100-foot square tents over those natural gas seeps and actually was using those for production. And I'm told that there's so much gas going into that methane that if they didn't offload it, it would have popped that, I don't know how many tons that thing weighs, but it's a lot. It would have just blown it right up to the surface. All right. It is amazing. So here's some photos from Bob that you had here at the exhibit. So of course, those oil platforms have now become marine little mini cities. And so the oil companies, when they first brought those platforms out to our channel, had no idea that marine life was going to attach to them. In fact, but it did. Even when they were barging those platforms up, it'd be flat to the surface. Even then, mussels were growing on them. So then they put them in place, and all this marine life starts growing on it, right? And Bob called that exhibit Marine Megatropolis because you have different types of marine life thrives at different depths. So by the wave zone, right at the top where the water is, the surface is, you get a lot of mussels and you get a lot of stars, right? Starfish. Further down, you get sea anemones. Further down, you get smaller fish. Then further down, the larger fish, right? And so the oil companies didn't engineer that extra weight into their calculations when they first built those platforms. And you're talking 4 to 5 tons of marine life attaches to those platforms. So what the oil companies would do is they'd pay commercial divers to go out to the platforms and scrape all that marine life off. My board president right now was one of those divers. He had a good life back then. He says what we would do is we'd go out to the platform, say, okay, we're going to do a survey dive, see what we got to do here. And they go down in the water, do a little surveying, do a lot of grabbing of maybe some abalone, some mussels, scallops, whatever else. Come back up top and say, okay, we're going to break for lunch. Then I think we know what we need to do and get the work done. So I don't know if Bob told you this story, but the stars and the mussels that are in the wave zone, big waves would knock those down to the bottom of that platform, right? And some of those platforms have 60 feet mounds of mussels down there. And the mussels are kind of stuck down there, right? But the stars want to get back up to the top because that's really where their food is. But the sea anemones sting them. And so they can't get over those. So Bob who was filming, doing photography and film of these platforms from 1974 to 81. He kept looking at this. I mean, he did 800 dives out there. And he finally said, you know what? I wonder what would happen if we clear one of those legs off. And so they stripped all the sea anemones off of one leg. And within 1 hour, those stars were coming back up to the top. Isn't that amazing? That's just so smart. So I should mention here before I forget it, now we're starting to decommission a lot of these platforms, right? We've already decommissioned Holly. Chevron is in town with a big crew now because they're going to decommission at least 3 of their platforms. And so there are questions what to do with these platforms. So at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum on November 20th, we're going to hold an expo, Alternative Uses of the Oil Platforms. And I don't know if Bob talked to you about all his ideas, because Bob Evans has a lot of ideas. But they're, these have become little marine sanctuaries. So Milton Love, a researcher, marine scientist at UCSB, has done studies, and he says that the oil platforms have 4 to 5 times more marine life around them than the rest of the ocean around it. All right, and you do have 4 or 5 tons of marine life here. When they took those platforms out in the 60s, a few of them, all that marine life just went to landfill. All right, so there's all different ideas. Obviously, some people want everything removed. That was the contract when the oil companies put it in. They were supposed to take it all out. But there's also a program called Rigs to Reef in the Gulf. They've cut a lot of these platforms, the tops off, either left them standing and marked them or put them down on their sides, and they become little marine sanctuaries. You can do agriculture out there. You can do solar energy, wind energy, wave energy, different things like that. So there's all different ideas. I mentioned that Summerlin was the world's first offshore oil wells. Well, the platforms in our channel here was the first alternative use of an oil platform. So they're macheting all those mussels off the platforms, right? And at one time there was a law they couldn't be used for human consumption. Well, they did tests of them and they said they were perfectly fine. And Bob was involved with this, and so he got it, helped get it passed so that they could start harvesting those mussels for human consumption. So that's one of the first cans of mussels from an oil platform for human consumption. Then they started trying to farm abalone out there. And so they were starting to do that out there as well. So these were really a different way to look at the oil platforms. Any divers out there? Oh, I know. I have 2 divers out there. Where are you guys? All right. Any other divers? Yeah? All right. Who's my divers? Where are you? Yeah, all right. So how far down have you gone? What's the deepest you ever dove?
250-ish.
Oh my gosh, were you a commercial diver?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So, boy, now I got to watch what I'm saying. So, do you use nitrous oxide, mixed gas?
We did mixed gas. We did helium work.
All right.
The work I did was there.
All right. So, nitrous oxide, you start to get narcosis, say 150 to 175 feet down. You get a drunken feeling. That nitrogen has that effect on you, right? And so, back in the 1950s, Santa Barbara was providing 2/3 of the world's abalone. We had boats built in Santa Barbara just for abalone diving called Radins, designed and built in Santa Barbara, and it was a big money. All right, they were catching and pulling up thousands of abalone a day. And so all the world's best commercial divers, a lot of them ex-Navy divers, came to Santa Barbara to become abalone divers. Well, we have this giant Monterey reserve of oil in the Santa Barbara Channel, right? And the oil companies knew there was oil there because it's been bubbling up for thousands of years. And so they wanted to put these platforms in and do more drilling. But they needed to go down hundreds and almost 1,000 feet to put those platforms in. And with that nitrogen oxide, nitrous, you get that drunken feel at 175 feet. You can't do much work down there. You're only good for a minute or two. So a guy named Dan Wilson was an abalone diver. That's him in that helmet. And in 1962, he takes this helmet. It's an old Japanese abalone helmet. I don't know if you can see that bump in the back, but he cut a hole in the back, had Santa Barbara Radiator Company welded back in so he can get a regulator inside that helmet. And he used helium oxygen. And we believe that was the first commercial use of helium oxygen. So in that helmet, on this dive right here, he went down 400 feet. All right, News Press did a big article about that, and 3 days later, he signed his first oil contract. By the way, you can see him on the side of the boat here. That doesn't look right? Commercial diver, you wouldn't do that? No. Well, they couldn't get his helmet off when he came back out of 400 feet. They couldn't unscrew it. So they had to loosen all the lug nuts that holds that breastplate in. And that was the only way they could get his helmet off. But it did work. He got good publicity, and he started doing oil diving using helium oxygen. So helium, you don't get that narcosis. You get very cold, right? So eventually they started flushing hot water into those suits to keep the divers warm, but you don't get the drunkenness at least. 2 years later, Dan Wilson was out at it's called Prisma Point, and he came up with the idea of the Prisma diving bell. By the way, that helmet is in our museum, and this diving bell is on our front patio. So this was the world's first commercial lockout diving bell. Now, the Navy had done lockout bells, but nobody had done it commercially. And that means that a diver can get out underwater, do some work on the ocean floor, get back into the bell, and then come back up to the surface. Now, this was first launched right here off this, what we now call the City Pier, the Navy Pier. That's the museum right there, the Maritime Museum. So it was launched right in front of the museum. And the very first time they launched it, it fell over on its side. Dan had a great idea, but he had no idea about center of gravity, right? So then they added a third bell to it, so that made it a little more stable in the water, but it made it very difficult to get on and off the surface ship here. Now, this was designed so that you could have an engineer from an oil company or two. And when you come to see this bell, it's not that big, but it was designed for two people up top here. They could stay at surface pressure and communicate to a diver. The divers, two of them, would be underneath in this lower bell, and they would go down to depth pressure, get out, and then they could communicate. You need to do this, you need to look at that, show me that. And then they can start compressing on the way up. But these divers were still wearing these big helmets, right? And you saw the big suits. And Dan didn't make the portholes big enough. So they had trouble getting in and out of the darn thing. So then they worked with a guy named Bev Morgan. Where's my commercial diver? You know Kirby Morgan, right? So Bev Morgan started working, designing these smaller masts and lighter weight diving gear. And so while this was not a commercial success, this bell only did about one or two commercial jobs. Then they sent it to a diving school. It is considered the first of its kind, and it did lead to the evolution of lighter weight diving gear. So Bev Morgan was a diver, photographer as well, and he was one of the first to work with polyurethane, and originally for diving suits. He eventually said, I bet surfers would like these suits, and tried to sell them to surfers. Mickey Dora, famous surfer back in the 50s, told Bev, wetsuits? No, surfers will never wear these things. But Bev was a very smart businessman. He would pay surfers to wear his wetsuits to surfing competitions. And then he sold that idea and that little company to two brothers, the Meisel brothers, and they started Body Glove. Around 64, Bev hooked up with a guy named Bob Kirby, also an abalone diver, ex-Navy diver, and they started in 1965 Kirby Morgan diving helmets. Now called Dive Systems International, but everybody really knows them as Kirby Morgan. Their design studio is right off Garden Street. If you come up the freeway and get off on Garden and turn inland, it's like the second street on the left. And they actually manufacture these helmets up in Santa Maria. And to this day, imagine having a business like this. To this day, they sell about 2/3 of the world's commercial diving helmets with no sales force, just word of mouth. My diver, you know this guy?
Yeah.
Ladd Hamilton. So Laddie was a rough kid, grew up in Hell's Kitchen, New York City, got in a little trouble. And so to kind of discipline him and give him a little direction in life, his family sent him to Santa Barbara to go work as a tender on an abalone boat for his uncle. Didn't know anything about diving, right? Bit of a daredevil, so he's a tender. So on a tender on an abalone boat, back in those days, you'd have three guys. You'd have a captain, you'd have a diver who's walking along the ocean floor collecting abalone, putting them in a bag, tugging, and getting the bag pulled up, and you have a tender whose main job is make sure the air hose, because it's on a hookah system, they're getting air from the surface down to the diver, making sure that air hose and the propeller of that boat don't meet one another, right? So he doesn't know anything about diving. He's just a tender. His uncle's going off and playing poker one day, so he says, I'm going to try this diving thing, throws a suit on, a helmet, jumps in the water, ends up upside down. The suit's all Black Fleet, a very famous abalone group of boats, about 7 of them in Santa Barbara. And that to him was really making it in life. But he went on to become an oil diver. And he started 2 of the world's first commercial international oil diving companies. Cal Dive, which just went out of business a couple years ago, and Oceaneering, which was in Santa Barbara and is now based out of Houston. And I bet they're about $1 billion a year company diving all over the world. And Laddie, he's a character today, but he was a crazy businessman. He would go meet with oil companies. They'd say, okay, we need to dive. The job is like 750 feet, you need to do this, this, and this. And Laddie said, oh yeah, all right, sounds good. He signs a contract, goes back to his office, talks to his divers, and his divers are like, we can't do that. We've never done that. We've never been down 750 feet. We've never done that work. And he's like, well, our name's on the contract. We got to figure it out. And they did. He was a very good businessman. I've been in the oil exhibit, platform exhibit in Galveston, Texas, and Ladd Hamilton's pictures on the Hall of Fame wall up there. And one of the things that Oceaneering did was they built the gym suit, and we have one of these in at our front door. These were about 800 pounds. These weigh out of the water, and they are designed to go down 2,000 feet underwater. Okay. At one atmosphere. So, anybody claustrophobic? Imagine that. So these were designed, you could pull your hands out of the arms, scratch your face. They had little handles and they had levers. You could maybe scratch your face, but that's about it. If you wanted to pick something off the ocean floor, you just leaned forward and the whole thing went down. And you did your work, you leaned back and the whole thing came back up. You ever dive in one of these? No. Sylvia Earle, you know that name? Sylvia Earle had a record for depth in one of these suits. Any James Bond fans? You recognize this suit? For your eyes only, the bad guy gets in this and goes after Bond and the girl. Now, Oceaneering wanted to sell these suits, right? This is brand new technology. So the deal they made with the movie studio is you can kill the bad guy in it, but it cannot be an equipment malfunction. So if you remember that movie, out of nowhere, Bond has a little magnetic or something bomb, and he slaps it on the back and blows the bad guy up. Oh, I love that. So, 1969. Anybody hear about this little oil spill back in 69? One person? All right, so 1969, first major oil spill in a pristine area. It was the largest spill at that time in the ocean. Now it is, I think, number 3 after, or in our area at least, after Exxon Valdez and the BP Horizon. Is that BP Horizon 1? This was 80 to 100,000 barrels of oil off of Platform A. All right? Obviously a disaster. A lot of marine life, bird life killed from this or damaged. And we had no idea how to remove tar and oil from these birds or the marine life. That had never happened before. All right? And just like that BP Horizon spill, there was no idea how to clean up the oil. All right? They tried about 30 different things. And this actually, straw hay was probably one of the best things they did to collect it. But what we like to talk about at the Maritime Museum is what this led to. So the 1969 oil spill led to the very first Earth Day. It was exactly 1 year later. Led to the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species Act, California Environmental Quality Act, National Environmental Policy Act, the first environmental studies program, which was at UCSB. There was a environmental declaration of environmental rights read into the congressional record. So a tragedy, but at least it had some good things come out of it. And you could see all that oil came into the harbor in Santa Barbara. All right. And the oil companies paid for every one of these boats to get cleaned, except for one. One guy said, "No, that's okay, I'll clean mine." He worked for an oil company. He said, "That's okay, I'll take care of it." But again, we've had this natural seep coming up for thousands of years. So that 80 to 100,000 barrels of oil, we get that bubbling up naturally in our channel every 2 to 3 years. All right. What's a travesty to this, for me, for this 69 oil spill is that platform was in federal waters. If they had followed the guidelines for the state of California, that spill probably would not have happened. All right, and you can see nobody knows where all that straw went to after it was soaked up the oil. I'm not sure where they buried that. And this is the environmental record read into congressional record. We have one of our past board presidents, Barry Schuyler. We have the Barry and Gene Schuyler environmental exhibit. That was written on Barry Schuyler's sailboat by a guy named Rod Nash, professor at UCSB. And then, of course, we had a more recent spill in 2015. All right, it was on land, but it went down a culvert, and some of that oil got into the water and polluted the water again. Okay, and for that reason, that's that pipeline that's closed, and I think 7 of the platforms in that area are still not in production right now. 4 of them will never be again because they have no way to get that oil to a refinery. And now we have, although for some reason I haven't quite figured out why, they're not to this spill right away. But there is a group called now, I forget the name, Marine Oil Response. It used to be called Clean Seas. And all the oil companies that have an interest in the platforms put into a fund. And we have one of their boats in our harbor and in a barge with all their equipment right outside our harbor. And I think there's another one north towards Point Conception. But that boat has to be able to get out of our harbor in 15 minutes, 24/7, 365 days a year when there's an oil spill. So they have to be out an immediate response to try to attack that spill. So here's my test for you. How much oil out of a barrel of oil is used for gasoline, percentage-wise? Can you see those numbers? Any guesses? 37? 27? A little bit higher. 47. 47. But most of it's used for other things. So we forget it's in wax, candles, it's in our clothing, it's in our makeup, in our lipstick, in our money, pretty much everywhere in our house. Anything that has plastic in it has oil in it, petroleum product. It is even in some of the chocolates we eat. All right? So we use it for everything. So this I just threw in because I thought it was pretty interesting. Because although there's not a lot of scientific studies available, but subjectively, back in the 60s, any surfers? One surfer? Two? All right. You would carry what with you if did you surf in the 60s around here? What would you carry with you? What is it? Wax. What else after surfing? Kerosene, something to clean your feet off because you'd have so much tar on your feet from surfing. All right, so some people believe that there's less natural seepage now after 40, 50 years of drilling for oil than there was 40, 50 years ago. And this study actually shows the seepages in one spot, just one spot near Platform Holly. And it seems to be much less 22 years later, 73 to 95 is that study. So just some facts. I don't know if you can read this, but California's oil production is down 56% since 1985. More than 56% of crude oil received by California refineries is extracted in foreign countries. 29% of foreign oil comes from Saudi Arabia. That might change lately. California refineries took in nearly 623 million barrels of oil in 2017. Our demand for oil declined for 5 years, from 2004 to 2009, but has been growing ever since. And the U.S. has become less reliant on foreign oil, but California has become more reliant. So that's all I have on oil. I do want to mention my shameless promotion. Through October 20th, we're doing Rum Running Sailors and Prohibition, all about the history of rum and Prohibition. We have a whole section on Santa Barbara's role in Prohibition. Did you guys have a talk here on this? You did? Who did it? You did? What's that? You did it. All right. So do you have Sansom clinics down here? No? So there's clinics up in Santa Barbara. They're pretty big. Dr. Sansom was the first American doctor to work with insulin. And he was doing diabetes research, and he was getting the insulin from pancreases. And he needed what to preserve pancreases? He needed alcohol, right? So during Prohibition, he drives down to L.A., picks up some alcohol, is coming back up, and gets pulled over and arrested. And we may never have heard of Dr. Sansom and never had Sansom Clinic in Santa Barbara, but fortunately for us, the Secretary of State for the United States had a daughter who was suffering from diabetes, and Dr. Sansom got special permission to carry alcohol and continue his diabetes research during Prohibition. So we talk about Santa Barbara's role, a lot of coastline, obviously a lot of distilleries going out on our Channel Islands and running back and forth from there. And one of the funny things about Prohibition, there were 3 times more bars at the end of Prohibition than there were before Prohibition. So it is an interesting story. So that's up through October 20th, and we're be happy to share that exhibit with you. We had another, and on November 7th, we open up these beautiful fish prints by 2 local artists, Dwight Wang and Eric Hochberg. And then we have the Harbor and Seafood Festival, October 12th. And we do a wine and seafood pairing on our front patio. So if you're interested, it's a great day. A lot of seafood at the harbor. And then if you're interested, we would be happy to share this exhibit with you. We just took it down a few months ago. This is Ralph Clevenger. He was a professor, taught at the Brooks Photography Institute. And this was face-to-face with the great white sharks. And I was actually, as were these 2 back there, raise your hands, with me on the dive boat with Ralph to go cage diving with the great whites down off Guadalupe Island. It is an amazing exhibit, beautiful, and it's such an enjoyable trip. I'm going back in 4 weeks. So that's all I have for you, but I'm happy to answer questions. Questions? No questions? This is oil. You got a question? Yes.
You said several platforms of refugio were going to be decommissioned. Are there any other platforms offshore that also?
So Holly has been decommissioned. That was owned by Veneco. And when the pipeline closed down because of the refugio spill, Veneco went out of business. And so the state took that one over. And so that one's definitely being decommissioned. I know Chevron has a crew here that's here to at least decommission 3 of those platforms. I think there might be 6 total that they're decommissioning. So what I know is about a third of them are being decommissioned. But
so like Gail and Gina and Grace, and you want to cut those off?
I don't think because those are still productive right now, right? Yeah, these are mostly the ones up by us that are no longer able to produce oil because the pipeline shut down. So the ones down here, as far as I know, are still going to be producing. Yeah. Yes.
Any ideas about what's happening to the Saudi Arabia gap? If we get 29% now and 50%?
Yeah, from what I heard, though, Saudi Arabia is going to use their reserves to fill in what they can't produce right now, and they already will be almost back. I know a lot of that will be back up to production in 1 week. So they're working very quickly to get it back up. But those are vulnerable, as we saw. Yes?
So the oil, the foreign oil that's pumped out of the ground, in what stage form is that shipped, exported elsewhere? Is it as it comes out of the ground?
I believe it's, I believe it's crude oil, and then they refine it here. That's my understanding, but that I don't know for sure. Yes?
With this natural seepage coming out, is there any way that you're going to harvest this methane gas or oil?
You know, they did those 2 tents, and that was successful, but the rest of them, I think, are so scattered, and so there's just so many of them. There's fissures all over the place. When we were doing research, and they're not just in the ocean.
Well, no, there's some in the foothills.
In the foothills, when we were doing research for this exhibit, we went out to the Santa Paula Oil Exhibit Museum, and we drove, the 150 to Ojai, which along that road was California's very first oil well. It wasn't successful, but there's a plaque there. But I think even before that, on the other side of the road, like literally the road is here, and right where this table is, was a pool of tar that you could dip a stick in, and it was just oozing. And that was just this giant pool of oil or tar. So it's just all over, but it's just so many little ones that it's hard to use that for production. But the question, I believe, I'm not a geologist, but I believe most of those fissures came from earthquakes, right? And so if we get more earthquakes, who knows what's going to happen? I am a big person, this is me speaking, not the Maritime Museum, but I'm a big proponent of wind towers, solar power, everything. But this oil here has been bubbling up, and it is still damaging our marine life, still damaging our bird life. And so it seems like if we can produce it and get rid of it, because if not, it's just sitting there, and when an earthquake comes, it's going to cause some damage. Yes? Okay. Sure.
Okay. Summerland, where all the wooden derricks were, and what does that look like underwater today? Do they just disintegrate?
Yeah, all the wood is gone by now. Back in the 60s when they first pulled them off, you could still see some of it, but most of that's all disintegrated. But I'm not sure how they got to go back in there and seal those wells, so something's still down there on the ocean floor, but I'm not sure what. Yes?
That last statement you said you had on your screen about California still dependent on
we still bring foreign oil in, sure.
But you only highlighted California?
Well, the whole country. Just talking about I just found that for California.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, we still bring it. I think we're over 50% of our oil that we use today comes from the United States. So it's gotten more. It's gotten increased as they've found different ways to find it. But that comes with some challenges too, because you got fracking and everything else. So, yeah. So, they're able to bring more up that way. Other questions? Yes. Yes.
Already asked one of that. Back in the BP oil spill, I recall hearing about microbes that were helping to remove the oil. Essentially, they were metabolizing the oil. Mm-hmm. Is that a thing that can be used in California?
Yeah, but they're not really sure what the other effects of those microbes. They are like artificial microbes you're talking about, right?
I did not.
Because
they were actually just natural stuff.
So there are natural things that consume oil. That we have them here, I believe, too, because it's also they have some seepage in the Gulf. So you have natural things that have thrived on that oil and adapted to it. But I think they also had dispersants that they added to that, and that has some issues environmentally. But the natural stuff, but I don't know if they can reproduce that. Yeah. In the back?
Would you anticipate the future of the offshore oil production? Do you think that is a possibility it could increase, or what's the prospect?
That it will. There will be more of that.
Or I know it's pretty prolific.
I mean, not in California. I just don't see it happening in California. And most of the oil companies are done here. They're getting ready to pull out. Yeah, it's just, it's easier for them to drill from the existing platforms. They can go further out now. And those platforms don't have one pipeline going down. They have dozens going in all different directions, and they'll go for miles. So I don't see them building a new platform at all. They could probably, Veneco, before they went belly up, they wanted to extend their area from the existing platforms, but they were denied, I think, for that. Yeah. So, but I wouldn't think. I know the state wouldn't allow that here. I doubt it. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
As they're closing these pipelines down, are they going to be taking the pipes out completely and stopping it so they won't have another break like they did at Refugio?
So, the break at Refugio had nothing to do with the oil platforms. And the Refugio spill, again, just like the 1969 oil spill, if they had followed the existing laws, that spill would have been very minor. But because that pipeline went across state lines, they got to use a federal law, not a California law, and they got an exemption from having an automatic shutoff valve. And if it had that automatic shutoff valve, which California pipelines are required to have, I doubt that spill would have been. I doubt any of that oil would have gotten to the ocean. Yeah, but your question about the pipe and all the infrastructure for those platforms, by law, the oil companies are responsible for getting those out. But the question comes, most of the big oil companies are out of those platforms. Chevron's and has maybe three. I forget whether it's 3 or 6. Exxon might have a few interests in. Well, they do. They can't. They have the ones that are not producing right now too. So they're trying to truck that oil out until the pipeline's done. So they have an interest in some. But most of those platforms are now owned by very small oil companies, and they might have one platform might have 4 different owners, or they just have like Veneco. That was their main source of income, was that platform. I mean, they had other stuff, but not a lot. So the question becomes, if you have a small oil company that has that platform and then they go out of business, who's responsible for getting all that stuff out of there? That's a good question. Some of them are still responsible. Some of the bigger oil companies are still responsible even after they've sold it. I don't know. That's a good question, because what's that? The grandfather? Yeah, as part of the turning it over to a new company, they still have a responsibility to take all the infrastructure out. But I don't know if that's the case in all of them. You would have thought when they first opened those that a little bit of each barrel would go into a fund to get them cleaned up afterwards, right? That just makes too much sense. Yeah. So who knows? Other questions? I love questions. All right. Anything else about the museum, Santa Barbara? How many of you been up to Santa Barbara Maritime Museum? All right. Good. Well, I hope we've had lots of changes. So if you haven't been up in the last 2 years, I hope you come back soon because a lot of new exhibits. You've all seen the lighthouse lens, right? You've been in since we put the Fresnel lens in? All right. Good.
Let's give Greg another big one.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next month.